My name is Chris Harris, and I'm here to talk to you about reproducible quantum chemistry in JupyterLab. So we're going to start off with an overview of what I'm going to cover in the presentation. So we'll start with the scientific use case to provide the motivation for the work that we're doing here. We'll then describe why we chose JupyterLab as one of the core components of our platform to enable the scientific use case. Then I'll outline our overall approach in terms of design and implementation. We'll then have a brief demo to provide some context so that we can then talk about the architectural components that support the underlying workflows that we're developing. And then we'll discuss some deployments that we've done, particularly a deployment at a National Lab supercomputing center. And then this is an ongoing project. So we'll then, by way of a conclusion, we'll talk about some of the future work that we're going to do in the next couple of years. So before I dive into the scientific use case, I just briefly want to mention the project and the team. So this work is supported by the Department of Energy through their SBIR program. We completed a phase 1 last year, so much of the work that we present here is from that phase 1. And we are just ramping up on a phase 2, and so we have another 2 years of work left. So the project is led by Kitware, and we have 2 collaborating institutions, Berkeley National Lab and the University of Buffalo, and they're providing much of the domain expertise in terms of quantum chemistry and machine learning. And I also briefly want to mention the Open Chemistry project, which its aim is to produce a set of open tooling to support the computational chemistry community, and that's what this project is part of. So quantum chemistry uses quantum mechanics to characterize chemical systems. And then that involves the Schrödinger equation that describes physical systems that exhibit quantum effects. Now, the equation can't be solved using analytical means for real-world systems, so computational chemistry uses a set of approximations and numerical methods in order to simulate a chemical system in software. Now, these techniques are computationally intensive, so they require high-performance computing resources, or HPC, in order to be able to simulate large systems in a reasonable amount of time. And so these techniques have seen vast improvements in both the veracity and volume of data that these techniques can produce. But progress has been hampered by a lack of transparent, reproducible workflows that use these computational codes. And so there are a couple of issues. The data management tends to be very ad hoc. In terms of there being a lack of structured data management, the appropriate metadata tends not to be stored with the outputs of these computational results. So a lot of the value is lost because there's no context. You don't know the versions of the particular quantum code that you're using, and the various input parameters can be lost. So what you'll find is data tends to be written to the file system of an HPC system, and then essentially it's lost because people simply don't know the context and they can't reuse it. The computational codes themselves have associated complexity. There's very little standardization in terms of the input and output formats. And then there's the intricacies of the HPC systems themselves. They have their own set of command line tools that you need to master in order to interact with them, and they have their own scripting dialogues. And even when you've actually produced some results using these quantum codes, there's still a lack of integrated environments for visualization and analysis of the results. So there's a real need for a platform that will enable end-to-end workflows, right from simulation setup right through to analysis and visualization of the results. And that's really the kind of key scientific use case that we're trying to support. So I hope a platform which enabled these workflows would kind of produce this cycle of knowledge discovery where scientists can share the results of their simulations, they can search for existing simulations that have already been done. The simulations will be preserved with the provenance and the analytic steps that they've performed. And so I hope to enable this nice cycle of knowledge discovery. So why did we choose Jupyter as one of the key components to support our workflows? Well, the notebook environment obviously provides the kind of interactive analysis that we needed to support these workflows. The notebook environment, with its linear structure of cells, obviously lends itself to codifying workflows. And then much of the provenance is stored within the notebook files themselves, which is an important thing to be able to reproduce these workflows. It's also a familiar environment in the computational chemistry domain. Notebooks are clearly becoming the de facto standard for this sort of analysis. And the language itself is also widely used within computational chemistry. There's a whole set of libraries and packages that we would be able to leverage if we use Python as the key language to encode these workflows. We understood that in order to produce this sort of platform to enable these workflows, we would need to extend the platform for the specific needs of our workflows. And Jupyter, in particular JupyterLab, which is the core technology we're using, has a simple extension mechanism that allows us to develop these complex domain-specific visualizations that can then be viewed within the workflow environment. And then, of course, it has a vibrant ecosystem and community that we really wanted to be part of, and we wanted to build on the great work that other people have done. And so we're really putting Jupyter and the Open Chemistry project at the core of this cycle of knowledge discovery that we want to be able to enable. So our overall approach was very data-centric. The data is the most important part of this platform. We wanted to make the data more available, and not just to those that initiated the quantum calculations, but also to other users. And so we wanted to basically derive more value from this valuable data, essentially. So we started with a small but powerful data model and encapsulated it in a data server. And then we could serve that data through a language-agnostic set of RESTful APIs. And that opened us up to a wide variety of different environments, from notebooks, web applications, command line tools, and desktop applications. And it provides a nice third-party integration point. People can write to these RESTful APIs. And then, of course, we're using Jupyter environment to do the actual analysis, the interactive analysis. But we needed a mechanism to encode the actual steps that the scientists were performing. And so with our collaborators, we developed a domain-specific Python API, high-level API, that was really tailored to the sort of tasks that they were doing. And that would be the language that would be used, or the API that would be used to essentially codify the workflows. And then we had a web application that provided much of the nuts and bolts of like notebook management. People could search notebooks. It was the launching point for notebooks. And then it provided access control and authentication. And it also provides a nice mechanism to interact with the data when you're not in a notebook environment. For example, if you're in a limited form factor device, such as a mobile phone, then a notebook isn't a great environment in order to actually visualize or look at the data. And so now we're going to switch to a brief demo by way of a screencast. The main reason I'm doing a screencast for the live demo is that these computational jobs take several minutes to run, even for like very small systems. And so I wanted to be able to show the entire workflow, including the actual computation itself. So I've actually edited the video so it speeds up time. So we'll start by logging into the system. And when you land within the system, you are essentially in your home directory, and you have a list of the notebooks that you're actually working on. And then we can select a particular notebook, the one that we prepared for this demo. And then you'll be launched into the JupyterLab environment, which most of you should be familiar with. And so the first thing we do within this notebook is we're going to actually import our high-level API. And this is the starting point for essentially our investigation. And then we're going to search for a particular structure. In this case, we're searching for aspirin. And what the system does is it checks to see whether it already has that molecule in the data store. If it does, then it simply returns it. But then we also have integration with some web services that can access online databases of particular structures. And then what we can do is we can call structure.show, and it will show a 3D rendering of the actual structure within the notebook environment itself. This is rendered with WebGL with a package called VTK.js, which is an open source package that Kitware is also involved in. And you can interact with the molecule and adjust some of the visualization parameters. And now what we're going to do is we're going to search for another molecule. We're going to search for ethanol. And we're actually going to use, rather than a common name, we're going to use something called an INSHI key, which is a commonly used chemical identifier. And we support many mechanisms for searching for these particular structures. And then once we've actually found the structure, we're actually going to set up some calculation parameters. And we're going to perform a geometry optimization on this particular structure. And so what this will do, again, it's going to check, do we have an optimization using these particular parameters, which is essentially controlling how we're going to solve that Schrödinger equation that you saw in the use case. And if it does, then it's just going to return the optimized result that someone else has already run. If it doesn't, then it's going to trigger a job on an HPC system. And rather than, when we actually call to show the structure, rather than showing the actual 3D visualization, it's actually going to show a pending calculations widget, which you see here, which shows the state of the job. And this is where I've actually compressed time. And this is actually running on an HPC system, and you can monitor the status of it within the notebook itself. And so it's now uploading, ingesting the data into our system, and it's now complete. And so once the calculation is complete, what we could do is we could just switch out to the 3D visualization of the actual structure. But we kind of felt that was against the spirit of the notebook environment. We felt that changing the output of a cell should really be as a result of direct user interaction, not like by a third party. And this is particularly important if you're running a calculation that takes many hours, and then you come back to your notebook environment. You really need the context that that calculation is finished, and then you can actually view the visualization. So we simply ask the user to re-execute the cell, which we'll do here. And then we have our freshly optimized structure of ethanol. And now what we're going to do is we're going to dive down deeper into the data and actually view the electronic orbitals associated with this particular structure. And here we have an isosurface visualization of the electron clouds associated with the structure. And we can adjust various things like the isosurface value. But it's also possible to create a more realistic visualization using volume rendering that VTK.js also supports. So we're going to switch to a volume rendering. And then we're going to have to adjust the transfer function, adjust the actual color map range, and the transfer function itself, so that we get a more realistic visualization of the structure. And there we have a better visualization of the actual electron structure itself. And you'll notice within our notebooks, we have this show method, which basically provides some sort of 3D interactive visualization. But where you see the show method, the user can also call a method called URL. And what that does is it actually displays an encoded URL, which points to the same data and the same initial visualization conditions. And so you'll see in the cell, we're going to be able to call URL on on the orbitals. And so we now have this encoded URL, and that's a nice mechanism to share with other users. And so if they click on the particular URL, then it'll open the same data and the same initial visualization within the single page application. And so this could be then shared on a mobile phone, for example. And this is using the same underlying data and actually using the same underlying widgets. And you notice down here on the right-hand side, there's a little icon, and that's actually a link back to the notebook that produced this data. So you can see the actual notebook when it was created, and if you click on it, you actually get a static view of the notebook itself. We're using NB convert to actually take snapshots of the notebooks when the data was created. So it provides a nice cross-linking between these kind of two complementary environments. So we'll switch back to the notebook environment. And now we're going to do a different type of computation, and we're going to do a frequency analysis on our particular structure. And so again, it's going to fire off this job running on this remote HPC system. And it goes through the different states. It's now running. We're compressing time. And it's now complete. And so we can re-execute this cell. And this provides a more interactive visualization. It's a split view. On the right-hand side, we have a chart that shows the actual frequencies and their intensities. And then on the left-hand side, we actually can provide an animation in 3 dimensions of the actual vibrational mode that we're which we're selecting at the time. So it looks a little bit like a dog. And so the final analysis that we're going to do within this notebook is something called a free energy analysis, which is basically we're going to set up a set of equations, and we're going to find out how much energy is released by a reaction, the reaction in these equations. And so what we'll do is we'll actually first of all set up our set of equations, and we're going to use simple Python templating. And so we now have our set of equations within our notebook cell. And in order to do the free energy calculation, what we need to do is we need an energy level associated with each of the unique reactants within that set of equations. Now, there's actually 8 unique reactants within that set of equations. And so when we call this high-level method show free energies for my reactions, then the system is going to have to fire off 8 jobs on our HPC resource. And so this is where it's particularly important that we speed up time, because this will take 10 to 15 minutes for all these jobs to complete. And so they're all now running and going through that uploading, and now they're complete. And so we can now re-execute this, and we'll see a simple InfoVis chart showing the free energies associated with our simple set of reactions. So let's switch back to the slides themselves. So I hope that that's provided some context that we can then discuss the architecture. The key takeaway from the demo should be that at no point within doing the analysis were we explicitly saying, I want to run this particular computational job on this particular HPC resource. It was much more driven by the data itself. We want to get this optimized structure. Please give me the optimized structure. And if it wasn't there, then we would initiate a job. So these computational codes have a wide variety of outputs, and the outputs tend to be non-standard or even non-structured. You can often find yourself parsing like a Fortran log file. And so we needed a standard or a normalized form that we could bring this disparate set of outputs into a single normalized form that could be then curated and stored. And through the past few years, the Open Chemistry project and the wider community has been developing this standard called chemical JSON, which is a simple JSON standard for representing chemical information. It can store things like the structure information, the geometry, the various chemical identifiers, so you can look up the particular structures. And then it can also store things like properties like melting points, atomic mass, for example. And so the nice thing about JSON is it's an efficient way of representing this data, and it fits nicely with the stack, the web stack, and also the Python environment. And then it also can be stored efficiently in a binary form, because we're actually using MongoDB as our kind of back-end data store. And there's actually some moves in the community. Mulsi are pushing towards making it a real standard within the community. But as well as supporting this kind of normalized form, we also wanted to be able to export the data in other formats that already exist out there. There's existing XML-based formats, for example. And so we provide RESTful endpoints for people to export in kind of standard formats. And that facilitates integration and prevents us kind of locking in this valuable data to our particular format. And so in terms of a data management system, we're using something called Gerda. And Gerda is an open source project that Kitware is involved in. And the idea behind it is it allows you to quickly and easily build data-intensive web applications. So it provides some of the nuts and bolts, things like authorization management, user management, and data storage and dissemination. And so it can get you up and running very quickly. And it can also be extended using a set of plugins. So you can develop plugins to add your own data models. And that's exactly what we did for our platform. We had added data models for things like calculations and structures. And then they can be served through these RESTful endpoints. So in the demonstration, you saw these very high-level API calls like optimize and frequencies. And we're firing up HPC jobs. And so what's involved in actually getting these jobs running? So the first step is something called input generation, which is basically where you generate the file that will control the actual computational code. And the formats of these are very specific to particular codes, and they're often pretty esoteric. And it controls things like the theory and the initial conditions. And so once you have that input deck, you can then move it onto your HPC resource along with the data. Now, these resources tend to be remote. They're the sort of thing that would be at an academic institution or a national lab. It's not the sort of thing that you'd have under your desk. And so there's a data transfer. And then you have to generate something called a submission script. And this is basically tells the scheduler, which is like the gatekeeper of the HPC resource, the particular program that you want to run, the particular set of nodes that you want to run it on, the types of nodes, maybe the amount of memory, and then you might specify how long you think the job's going to complete. And these submission scripts are specific to the particular scheduler, and they sometimes have site-specific information in them as well. And then you can use that submission script and submit it with a set of command line tools that, again, are specific to the scheduler. And then once your job is complete, then you have to do some sort of post-processing, like move the data back to maybe your desktop to do the analysis. And so the takeaway here is that there's a whole bunch of steps that are required in order for you to get your data, but they're not directly related to the actual kind of knowledge discovery that you're trying to do. And so we want users to be able to focus on the knowledge discovery and not on job execution. And so the way we've done that is we try and shield the user from as much of the complexity as we can. We make job execution implicit with sane defaults. So a lot of these codes have a whole set of different parameters that you can tune, but the user's probably only interested in a handful. And so when we talk about implicit job execution, we're talking about initiating jobs as a result of searching for a particular data set that isn't already there. And so we're allowing the user to concentrate on the data and the analysis rather than the underlying codes. And so one of the mechanisms that we use to allow our workflows to be moved between HPC resources is a scheduler abstraction. And so this is kind of the gateway to the HPC resource. And so we write our APIs to this high-level API that we've developed, and then that allows you to move between particular resources. And then in terms of abstracting away the input decks, we're using templating, so we can provide same defaults, and then we can just override the particular ones that the user's interested in. Now these jobs take hours to even days to run, and so the kind of monitoring and submission interaction with the actual schedulers themselves can't really be done in like the request thread of an HTTP request, and probably not even within the kernel itself. And so what we do is we actually use a distributed task queue to offload those operations. And so that means provides us a mechanism to support what we call offline job execution, which is essentially you can run your notebook and that will initiate some HPC job. And then you can close down your notebook environment and even shut down your computer, go home for the day. You can come back in, and whilst you're at home, the task scheduling, the actual job execution will continue to run. It will continue to monitor the state of the job, and when the job's complete, it will ingest the data. And so you can basically restart your notebook and just check in on how your job execution is doing. So you saw that within our web application, you can launch notebooks from within the web application. And so we're using Jupyter Hub to do that. We're using the Docker spawner, so our JupyterLab or Jupyter servers are running within Docker containers. The nice thing about that for us is that we can then have a simple mechanism for deploying a complex JupyterLab environment. We can preload a Docker image with all the libraries that needed to support the workflows. And then Jupyter Hub will take care of spawning these containers. And so to facilitate that integration, we actually had to write a Jupyter Hub authenticator, which allowed us to cross-authenticate between the web application and the Jupyter Hub environment. And so the user would log in with their credentials, and then we would use those credentials also to authenticate with Jupyter Hub. And so that allowed us to then craft a simple URL that we could redirect to Jupyter Hub, and Jupyter Hub would take care of spawning the notebook environment for us. So the notebooks encode the workflow, and so they're valuable data, and they really belong in the data management system themselves. And so we're storing them alongside the data, and we're making them searchable, and we're making them available to others. And we're also interested in versioning, and we're interested in what the community is doing in terms of versioning. So if you've got ideas, we'd be happy to talk to you about it. We understand that some people are doing like Git repos to do versioning between different versions of a notebook. But we're interested in doing things like diffing, so you can see how a workflow changes over time. In order to get the data within our data management system, we actually had to write a contents manager. Within the notebook environment, on the left-hand side, there's this file browser widget. That's actually backed by an API within the notebook server itself called the Contents Manager API. And so usually it's browsing the local file system where the server is running. But we implemented an API that then browses the girder, essentially the girder structure, the hierarchical structure. So that allows us to not only access data in girder, but it also allows us to store the notebooks themselves in girder. And that's particularly important when you're using the Docker spawner, because obviously the storage within the containers is kind of ethereal, but by storing it within our data store, it's available. So that's some of the core kind of components of the back end, and we'll now move to the front end. We have this kind of two interaction modes. We have a web application, and then we have JupyterLab. And we're going to concentrate on talking about JupyterLab. At the very low level, we're actually using web components for our visualization components. The nice thing about web component technologies is it basically allows you to encapsulate a complex component within essentially a new HTML tag. And so then you can use that HTML tag within any infrastructure you want, any framework. You're not tied to a particular framework. It just has attributes just like any other HTML tag. And so we're using Stencil.js as our compiler. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to share the same viz components between the web application and the notebook itself. And we're using two packages for our 3D rendering. One is VTK.js. We're using that particularly for volume rendering. And then we're using 3DMold.js that provides more specific chemical 3D structure rendering. In terms of JupyterLab extensions themselves, we're using the MIME renderer interface as kind of our main extension point. It provides a simple mechanism for us to basically plug in new visualizations based on a MIME type. Within the components themselves, we're using a React Redux stack. And they fetch their data directly from the data server rather than communicating with the kernel itself, And the main reason for that is that it allows us then to share much of the code between a web application and the actual kernel environment itself. And they're pretty thin by design, and that's because most of the functionality is in our web components. And the nice thing about that is it really increases your development, reduces your development cycle. You don't have to have a full notebook environment in order to kind of develop these components. And that was particularly important in the early days of JupyterLab when if you were building an extension, it would take many minutes to complete. So that kind of sped up development for us. One of the interesting challenges when you have these very interactive kind of visualizations in the outputs of cells is how you store what we're calling interactive provenance. So you saw in the demo, we were selecting a particular vibrational mode. Now that's useful information. The scientist obviously thought that that was a particularly interesting vibrational mode, and so it probably should be stored in some way so that people looking at the notebook could see that that was the particular interaction. Or even if they're changing the particular 3D view to a particular orientation, then that's valuable information. And so again, we're interested in how the community is tackling this, whether they're storing it within the notebook file themselves, or if they've got other ideas. We'd be really interested to hear from you. And so we adopted TypeScript for our extensions at the recommendation of the JupyterLab team pretty early on. And it turned out to be great advice. And we're not only using it within our notebook extensions itself, we're actually using it within the wider set of components. It's really nice to have these typed interfaces when interacting with multiple applications. So a few quick words on deployment. We have quite a stack. We have about 8 Docker containers for the individual components with our stack. So we're using Docker Compose as a simple mechanism to spin up parts of the stack in different environments. And then we're using Ansible for our runtime configuration. Ansible is a nice mechanism which allows you to write a declarative description of how you want your server to be configured, and then you can run it against your server, and then the appropriate changes will be made to the server. And then in terms of deployments, we've done 2. We've done one on AWS, where we have a small set of EC2 instances that form our cluster that we can then run jobs on. And then we've done a more elaborate deployment at the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center, or NERSC. And that was an interesting one because in order to allow users to run jobs on their supercomputers, we had to integrate with their credentialing system. So it would allow users to log into our web application using their NERSC credentials that are provided by the National Lab. And then those credentials would be passed through into the notebook environment, or the tokens would be passed through into the notebook environment, which would allow them to initiate jobs on Cori, which is actually the top, I think it's the 10th fastest supercomputer in the world currently. And so it's pretty amazing to be able to be in this notebook environment and you search for a particular calculation, and then it fires off this job on this really sophisticated piece of hardware. So we have another 2 years of time left on this project. And so these are some of the kind of high-level areas of investigation. We're looking at extending our collaboration features. Currently, you can browse other people's notebooks, but we'd like to essentially add a fork button so that it can copy the static view into your own home directory, and then you can modify it, run it, or just even repeat the results to see whether it is indeed a valid notebook. And then we're interested in real-time collaboration within notebooks themselves. Think kind of like Google Docs, where you can both be editing the document at the same time. And I know that the community is working on how we might enable that. Much of the work for the phase 1 was based on a computational code called NWChem. We want to integrate with more computational codes. And so that's really going to test out some of the abstractions that we've made over the kind of computations and the parameters that will be available to search for particular calculations with. And then machine learning is a really hot topic in the chemistry community at the moment. It's actually a really hot topic in probably every community at the moment. And so within the chemistry community, essentially what they're doing is they're using the results of traditional computational chemistry jobs. They're training models, and then these models can predict really quickly and really accurately the properties of new chemicals. And so we're interested in from 2 points. One is using these actual models within our workflows themselves, and also providing bulk downloads of data, existing data, so that they can be used as training data sets. And then finally, we're interested in using the semantic web more. In the phase 1, we kind of dabbled a little bit in the semantic web, but we're interested in enriching our data in terms of the metadata associated with these calculations by adding things like semantic triples, and then also pushing some of our data to the semantic web, so make it more discoverable by other kind of knowledge graphs. So thank you very much for listening. Please come and visit us at openchemistry.org or check out our GitHub org. The Open Chemistry project has a wide variety of different open source projects within the materials and chemistry community, and we'd be happy to chat to you afterwards. And I've got some awesome Open Chemistry stickers as well, so if you come and chat to me, you can get one. Thank you very much. Anyone got any questions? 8 minutes, perfect. Shreyas.
Yeah, so do you have is the HPC execution widget code, is that available?
It's all available. It's all open source, yeah.
Do you know what that package is called? Or?
What, the actual widget within the notebook?
Yeah, the widget. So
yeah, so there's...
I mean, that's something we could just use right away in a bunch of different things.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of complexity. There's quite a lot of things going on behind it. So it's actually 2 packages. It's a package called Cumulus, which is actually available under the Kitware org. And so that's the bit that kind of does the job submission, the interaction with the scheduler, and the job monitoring, and it uses this distributed task queue to do it. And then the actual components themselves are under the Open Chemistry project. And I can send you an email with them. Yeah. Yes? Sure.
But you talked about adapting to different kinds of display environments, and I'm just wondering if you thought at all about VR.
Not explicitly. I mean, certainly at Kitware we have groups that are working on VR, but we haven't really thought about applying it directly to this. I think some of our collaborators, I think Bert, one of our collaborators at Berkeley National Lab, he's very interested in using VR in the chemistry kind of world. Sure.
Looking at your list of, if you go back to the list of future applications.
Yes.
Is VASP on that list at all, or is that potentially on that list?
Potentially. We've got a lot of things on our list.
We want to make it very easy for other people to add codes as well.
Yeah.
So we don't really want to be the gatekeepers.
Yes.
We are trying to make this a very open and accessible platform.
Yeah, so I think the idea with this is that we would use this as to kind of make sure that it was a simple process, and then we'd let the community go nuts with it. Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges with these codes, as I mentioned, is making sure you can get the format or ingesting the formats into our kind of standardized, normalized form. Any other questions? Get to go to lunch early. Thank you.